That's fine. Would those of you who are in the back have a seat or whatever? My name is Margi Reeve, and I'm the Director of Publications at SCI-Arc. And tonight, Kim Abeles is going to talk to us about her work. She has put a lot of work up here for you to look at, which after the lecture, feel free to come up and take a look at it. There are a lot of books and various pieces that she's done that you can feel free to share. Kim is known as an artist, an educator, and an activist. Her work ranges from limited edition books to room-size installations and World Wide Web projects. She's maintained a studio in downtown LA since 1980, and I think that her work could best be characterized by the fact that it is research that covers a broad range of subjects. And I thought that it might be interesting for you to know a little bit about her background. When I was looking at her biography today, I was struck by a number of things. I'm going to sort of mention a few of them. When she was 17, Kim went to Japan as an AFS student. When she was there, she met a Buddhist priest from whom she learned calligraphy, ceramics, and kimonos. All of these things have stayed through her work. When she was 20 years old, she had her first work of art published in 17 magazine. She received her BFA from Ohio University, came to California, and studied at Irvine, where she got her MFA. For 3 years, when she was in Los Angeles, she supported herself by answering letters to Miss Lonely Hearts. In 1992, she received the Clean Air Award from the South Coast Air Quality Management District for her Smog Collector sculptures. I think this is probably something that no other artist has ever received. And her projects, I'm going to list a few of them that she's done such a broad range of work that it's difficult to sort of characterize it, but I think the variety of it is extraordinary. Among the projects she's completed are 1,046 handmade cobblestones, Saint Bernadette souvenir cards, which were left in phone booths at Lourdes, a drawing of Los Angeles to Del Mar, which is south of Los Angeles, as seen from a moving train, a piece that had to do with the garment district, which she lives near, which was made up of labels from clothing of 4 different people, and they were sewn together with neckties. She's also done works of art that are based on subjects such as the Dead Sea Scrolls, Calamity Jane, and tarot cards, which were an educational project about AIDS. Kim's art has to do with questioning both the parameters of truth and the conventional methods of bringing art to the public. She is actually no stranger to SCI-Arc. In the 1991 issue of Off-Ramp are some of her pieces. So Kim's work in Los Angeles obviously reached as far as Santa Monica by 1991. And I think tonight she's going to share some of the projects that she's done before then and some recent work. Please welcome Kim Abeles.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for such a wonderful introduction. In fact, I brought with me a number of the HIV/AIDS tarot cards that I'll pass out to you after I speak, and you can have them, and also another card to help you check the color of the sky to make sure that it's healthy for breathing. what I did tonight was to really focus on art that I've done that's about the city, though I do a lot of biographies on historical characters. I thought it might be of most interest to all of you to see my kind of quirky way of seeing what Los Angeles looks like. I think I'll just go ahead and begin. Let's see. Okay, don't look at that one. Okay. Oh, there we go. Okay. Ever since I had my studio in downtown Los Angeles, I've really felt this need to discuss the area around me. I found it kind of impossible to step out on the streets and then go up to my studio on Broadway at the time and kind of ignore what I had seen on the streets below. And as you know from the introduction, I've had that studio since 1980, and then I've moved to 2 other studios since then. And at the time I moved in downtown LA, most of the spaces were really sweatshops with a few artists scattered in between. And many of the pieces really had to do with those sweatshop workers, because I would share the bathroom with them down the hall from my studio, and I'd see these women work very diligently on these garments. And at the time I was making kimonos, and sometimes I couldn't tell quite the difference between us. And at one point I asked them for all the scraps of from all the dresses that they had made, and I put them onto this kimono that you see on the left, and asked the sweatshop owner if I could have the old time clock, which was encrusted with the lint from the air. So this piece with its harness is really describing a biography about people in the city. On the right is a similar experience where the piece really comes out of both observing my surroundings and also interacting with the people. There were some guys that had a shoe shine stand down the street from the studio, and I asked them at one point if they would save all the shoe shine tins, because I wanted to do a piece about their stand. And as you see on the bottom, the shoe shine tins line the lower section, and the shoes are actually men's wingtip shoes that are bronze plated. And if you could look into this shoe shine stand, you'd actually see pornography on both the left and the right. I always wondered why the guys getting their shoes shined always kind of stared in either direction instead of straight on. So the piece has that too. The other kind of weird thing about this piece is it has these shoe shine brushes on the bottom, and often I've seen people come and scrape their shoes against this sculpture, and it always strikes me as really weird, since people aren't supposed to touch art, and here they are like taking their filthy shoes and like cleaning them against the piece. So in a way, I think it's probably pretty successful from that level. These are 2 examples of some other works that really have to do with the women that I saw. Though all the work that I do is a biography in nature, this is where the work about the city really becomes more personal. The piece on the right is actually a figure in the center of it, and I wove it on the loom sculpture that you see, and it's made out of hundreds of opened up hangers. And then there are 7 shirts, and it really deals with the idea of people who work in jobs where they really have to work 7 days in order to survive. And you see on the left with that piece, it's an upside down sewing machine that now looks like some kind of sacrificial lamb. This particular piece also came about from looking out of my perch in that 4th story studio in the Victor Clothing Building. And I would take note that at night, all the cars would sort of, leave the city in one whisk, and then in the morning, all the commuters would kind of whoosh back into the city, and it was so weird living down there at that time when I was one of the few people living down there, and how the city really empties out at night. And so the cars really reminded me of swarms of cicada bugs, and the way that, you know, every 13 or 17 years they come out, and when they come out, I don't know if any of you have ever lived in the Midwest. When the cicadas come out, they come out with such great force that you have to even use your windshield wipers on your car to get past them. They're not locusts, they're different, but they come out in the same kind of swarm that you imagine with a locust infestation. And so I did a painting of the parking lot outside the studio window, and I mounted hundreds of cicada shells that had had their wings removed by another artist who had given me the shells, and I made their wings from smoke on glass, and so you see those dark sections hovering above the cicada shells. And smoke seemed like a perfect material because smoke really comes out of all those automobiles, and smoke is also used to try to get rid of infestations of bugs. This will show you a better detail of how that smoke sort of layers above the cicada shells. I've done a number of pieces through the years that has to do with the raising of buildings. I find it distressing, as I'm sure a lot of you do, to see how many beautiful buildings of historical importance have been torn down through the years, especially in the 70s. Seemed to be a really grim time for this. The Booter building was a very gorgeous building in St. Louis, Missouri, and I followed quite closely because one of my family members had owned the building originally, and I followed closely the efforts of the Conservancy trying to save the building, and ultimately it was torn down. So on this piece, what I responded to about this newspaper article was Mr. Booter has his desk behind him that you see in this newspaper article, and there's a stack of papers that's behind him, and I'm always sort of in awe of how much paper really comes across any of our desks and how much our lives really depend on that paper. And so what I did was to recreate that pile of paper that he had, and then I poured concrete on it, and then I've excavated it. So that's what that center section is. On the chiffon that rolls along the top of the piece is a stencil that shows the building across the street, again from my studio downtown, as it was being torn down, and you see the different levels being taken down in a sort of abstracted version of that process. This is another piece about the raising of buildings, and it turned out to be sort of a creepy prophecy, because I don't know how many of you recognize it, but the Sphinx and some of the images that we really can't see from the slide, but images that surround the sculpture are from the downtown LA library. And in the center section is a pile of ashes, and in the top area I've created that same building being torn down, but this time I used the stencil of that image and created the image out of smoke. So it was sort of awful when the library was burned down, you know, when the arson fire happened years after this, to sort of see that it really discussed that same issue. At the time of doing the piece, I was dealing more with the issue of book burning and names of streets changing and tearing down buildings and all these different ways that we really lose our history. A lot of my work, in the way that I pull it together, even the pieces that you've already seen, are typically done in a performance style in terms of who I am as the artist. This is a pretty good example of one. I built this very simple observatory, and during the time between new moon and full moon, I would crawl into it and I would chart the path of the moon and the sun. And so in a way the process becomes a very relevant part, especially for me, in the way that I gather this information. This is stuff you could get from any kid's, science book, but somehow I find the experience of actually gathering the information allows it to really reach under the skin and into the bone. The final installation looks like this, where I've cut out the moons and I've painted the suns, and under each I've charted the time of day and the date and pulled together the 90 panels, create this idea of the way that the celestial bodies move through space. Similar type of approach happened as a result of a day when I was driving up Broadway in downtown LA, and my studio is at 2nd and Broadway, so this is the view from my studio fire escape. And I looked north and I saw the San Gabriel Mountains, and I thought, this is unbelievable. This is beautiful. And I had had my studio there for about 9 years at the time, and I had never seen them. And I knew they were there, but I didn't know they were like so close. And so I decided that I would photograph every day and see how long it would take me to see them clearly again. And it wound up taking me 1 year and 2 months. And you can just make them out on the right-hand slide. You can see the silhouette of it, but that's not a clear view. And ultimately, I housed all those attempts to get a clear view in a structure that I built as a big walk-through bellows of a camera made out of wood and paper. It's actually illuminated from the outside because of the way I painted the paper. The pink is very thin paint, and the turquoise area that you see is thicker. And so the illumination shines through these photos, so they glow and sort of have this hazy pink color when you get closer. What happened with my experience actually was that when I saw the mountain that second time, and believe me, everyone that knew me kept giving me phone calls saying, you better go outside. Really, it's clear out, honestly. And to me, it's like I knew what clear was going to look like because I had had that first experience of that beauty. And in the end, a photograph of that second clarity or that second coming really could not compare to a painting that I might make of that mountain wedge. As with that observatory territory piece, a lot of this is about actually documenting times of days and dates. And it's really a combination of making something that is sort of semi-scientific as well as poetic. Typically what I do with these installations is to make what I call footnote pieces or ancillary pieces that tell more about the topic or more about the experience, because I find that in one large installation it's really not enough to be able to sort of encapsulate what this experience was. So I tend to make these smaller pieces. For instance, the piece on the right, it's a gas mask, and then of course refers to the smog, and I stuffed the end of it with my cat's fur because I don't know, I know a lot of friends with cat allergies. It's like, that strikes me as like the best way to describe what it's like not to be able to breathe. And on the left is a little box that's like a music box in a way, and I have some fabric that's hanging in front of a photograph of the view north on Broadway so that it's really obscuring that view just like the smog does. Other pieces really related to the idea of taking so many photographs. This is a clock that charts all the times that I took those photographs. It's actually a workable clock, but you really couldn't tell the time with it. This piece was originally exhibited at Occidental College, and they had this beautiful fireplace there, and there's always that joke about artists making paintings to go above couches and paintings being selected for that couch. So I thought it'd be really funny if I matched the frame to the fireplace and, just be done with it. So actually they own this piece now, so maybe that's a good strategy. Another piece and a number of others actually referred to the sort of romantic view of trying to take all these pictures, that in photography there's such a dialogue about wanting to capture memory, and there's also a more literal way of looking at photography that Susan Sontag mentions in her book on photography, which I highly recommend, by the way, where she talks about the idea that we really shoot pictures, and that sort of psychology that happens when we take someone's photograph and so on, and sort of viewing photography as something more literal, and the idea of a photograph as something literal as an object. So I did things like weld a small replica of my 35 millimeter camera, and then covered it with mosquito netting, and then filled it with pigeon feathers as a romantic kind of way of looking at the photograph and the camera. And on the right, it's the invisible camera, which is actually created by the structure around it, and then invisible thread really completes the image of that camera. And you see, actually, the shape of that outer structure is the shape of my mountain wedge. As a second phase to this project, because I grew to really think that particular part of the San Gabriels was mine, and I think it still is. I take note of it all the time. I decided on a first smog alert day that I would walk from 2nd and Broadway downtown to the San Gabriels and see how close I would have to be to get a clear view. Well, I wound up having to walk all the way to the mountain, because some of you that maybe know Pasadena and Altadena know that the closer you actually get to the mountains, the smoggier it gets. So the closer I tried to reach it, the further away it seemed. And I went as the crow flies, which means that if I had to knock on people's doors to cut through their houses, I did that, and through their backyards and under freeways and over barbed wire fences and over single train track bridges, and in fact, I never really appreciated this piece as much as when I was speaking with the the Forum for Urban Planning and Architecture. Is that it? You know what group I'm talking about? And they just loved this piece because suddenly it, there was this idea that it totally forgot about all the traditional boundaries that we have in urban planning and in cities, and just disregarded it entirely. And I really grew to see sort of the broader beauty of it. I mean, for me, it had so much to do with my Sisyphus search for nature. I'm always sort of looking to find where nature is. It's like, I'm sure it's somewhere, it's other than the museum. And it was also about, going through this kind of experience where, for instance, sometimes when I was on the walk, kids would follow me, like 10 kids at a time, and they'd sort of accumulate, and I was sort of like the Pied Piper going along, and sometimes I'd be in neighborhoods and mothers would run out and go, honey, you really shouldn't be in this neighborhood. And then sometimes I'd knock on doors of, these beautiful mansions, and the door would open and I'd see one of my friend's paintings in the foyer, So for me it was this elegant experience of really being able to see Los Angeles for the first time. I actually got a free bus ride back because I looked so beat up that the bus driver said I really deserved a free ride. After doing that project, I actually do a lot of workshops in both universities and with teens that have to do with walking. By going through that experience, it did crossed my mind many times, the fact that so often in a city like Los Angeles and any kind of contemporary way of looking at the urban, that we always view that urban from a moving car. We never really see what the buildings look like, or see who the people are, or see what the sidewalks look like. And so I plan different excursions with groups, and then we pull them all together as a piece of art. I wish I had better documents of this, but this will have to suffice. On the left, I took the kids at the Santa Monica Continuation School, and we walked from Santa Monica High School to the McDonald's. It seemed like such a perfect kind of walk, like such a perfect place to go. And it's a walk that these kids have taken a lot. And I taught each teen how to gather information in a different way, whether it was audio or through film or rubbings or collecting found objects or various ways. And then we pulled them all together as a piece of art. And what was kind of interesting to watch is that sometimes people who were very shy, suddenly by the end of this walk, would go up to strangers and ask them their opinion on this place where they were standing at one point. So I really found that it offered a certain engagement within someone's own neighborhood. On the right is just a document from a piece I did at Cal State Chico, and I worked with the students by dividing up Chico into the normal plots that the map would grid up the area with, and everybody had to pick a plot, and then they could do anything they wanted to sort of explain what that plot was or to do something to it, and everyone had very different responses. And what I did to develop the project with them was I made a little book that offered them suggestions on how they might document that plot, and then the piece was all pulled together. So I sort of like this idea, because I do teach a lot, that you might give somebody a book to get them started, like a little sort of sweet, intimate book as a way to begin a project, so that from the very beginning of presenting the idea, there's a creative effort that's being generated. Last year I did a piece with MoCA. They took this house at Temple and Beaudry that is slated for being torn down. It's owned by Metro right now, and they had several artists go in and do projects that were really a recreation of the house project that happened during the 70s. And I was given the orientation room, which was to explain what the entire project was about, and also to sort of orient this house in some way within the city. And I created a periscope out of plumbing pipe, and it actually worked. It sort of lifted up, and you could turn it, and you could see the freeway, and you could see the financial district. It merely had some simple mirrors inside. It was quite a simple thing to put together. But I like the idea that you would take the house as sort of the center of the world, and that you would take something that was not moving, for which a periscope is typically designed, and make it somehow workable within that space. I also researched a lot about what that area looked like historically. So in the orientation room, it had many historical images that showed you pretty much the view you were seeing surrounding the house as it looked, say, at the turn of the century. I worked with kids that were from the Magnet High School across from the house, and what I did was to blow up the map that again made the house the center of the city, and create them on paper so that then the students really brought to them any kind of mixed materials they wanted. I've said many times as a joke that I don't know why people make abstract paintings when there are maps, and this was really to take that idea and push it to the edge. You can see from the frames also, just to get everybody kind of warmed up, we collaged just old maps onto the frames as a way to make them more decorative. I tend to look at the idea of mapping in different ways also. On the left is really a very small detail of a 12-foot tall drawing that I did by walking a 60-block radius of the city of downtown LA. It went up 2nd Street to Figueroa and over to 7th Street and then down to Alameda. And for any of you that know downtown Los Angeles, that really goes through quite a variety of both architecture as well as activity. So it goes through, you know, like the hooker and drug district as well as through, you know, the financial district and everything in between. Often when I go out to do these kind of projects, I do them sort of like a shot in the arm. I tend to feel that every now and then I need to do a project that really takes me out there on the streets so that I'm not just sort of doing this theoretical thing about what I think about life, that I really have to sort of put myself in that situation. And it's usually a pretty good wake-up call. I was measuring buildings yesterday and today, like with a tape measure downtown for a piece I'm working on, and a couple people came up to me that thought I was going to restructure their property tax. So a lot of times people don't really realize that it's art and they always think it's something else, and then for me it's a way to engage people in the discussion about art. On the left, on the right are two examples of the skylines that I've done in many different cities around the world when I've traveled, where I gain access to the top of a building and then I stand in one pivot point and then I turn and do that entire skyline. And here you see New York and LA. This is the one that was mentioned before of the view out the moving train. In fact, on the right you're seeing about half of the drawing. And on the left you can see the detail to see what this looks like. The piece is called a mile a minute because I calculated that's how fast I was drawing. And it does go from LA to Del Mar. I tried to get somebody to fund me to do LA to New York, but I don't think anybody really took me seriously. So I think at this point they'd probably realize I would do it. And what I liked about the way this piece turned out, by the time I got to Del Mar, there were about 8 kids that had asked their parents for pencils and paper, and they were doing it also out the window because they thought it looked so great what I was doing. So I sort of felt like I was on the right track with this. This kind of information is translated in various ways onto sculpture. This is a little hard to make out, but on the posts on the left and right of this piece are actually 2 horizon lines of cities that are placed vertically. So you have to turn your head to read them. And this corset is made out of a U.S. domestic mail bag. This piece is actually about a bi-coastal love affair that a friend of mine had. And it uses the idea of these horizon lines as a language that you see on the envelopes. This was a more practical use of these horizons. I have been asked to do an outdoor piece on Santa Monica Boulevard. I believe it was Santa Monica near La Cienega. And I went up to the site. It's that real grassy strip that runs on Santa Monica Boulevard. Some of you may know that. And anyway, I went up there and it was really ugly. It was like everywhere I looked, all the buildings were just disgusting and it was just an eyesore. So what I did was I very carefully rendered the view from each of the posts that line that area to block out the view, so that as the viewer, if you go up to any of these, you sort of block out whatever the view looks like. So these are probably good things to put around different places in the city. A different type of charting that I do has to do with the sky, and I'll show you other work that I've done with air pollution, but in this case I built a contraption that has a little sort of a viewfinder opening in it, and I placed it in the same spot toward Riverside for 60 days, and during that time period I painted the sky color. So what you see in the samples that are sort of like standard brands paint samples in the back are actually the colors of the sky for those 60 days. And of course blue does not often come up. Typically it's sort of yellow and green. And what was kind of interesting to me about this is that I had done some reading about French investigations that people view nature in the way they remember it. So in other words, if you look out into a city and you see ahead of you, you don't see all the tension lines and all the signs. You just somehow look beyond it. Your mind is powerful enough to sort of see past it. And in the same way, every time I went to go paint the sky, even though I knew it wasn't blue, I would always start with like a mix of blue and then have to throw out that first batch of paint and then go toward these other colors. It was so powerful in my head that the sky is blue. I had been told that all my life, that it was really difficult to see anything else. What I did with this information also, when it was at Oberlin College, we made little peek holes in the beautiful arched windows so that you could see the sky of the Oberlin sky also. And we also went through their permanent art collection and pulled out paintings that referred to historical renditions of what the beautiful American sky looked like. This material is then translated into smaller pieces. On the left you see dabs of sky, so it's just little dabs of paint that are those same sky colors. And on the right is the same information of the 60 days placed into the form of a clock. And here it is on the right in the heads of pins, and on the left is a wallet-sized sky, so you could just carry it around with you. And then the perfect sky also in the wallet in case you forget. The Smog Collectors really started from a frustration because I was living in a studio at the time where we were, there was a factory that was emitting formaldehyde and other fumes, and we tried to work through the normal bureaucratic channels to have something happen, and nothing happened, and the process is very slow and so on. And so out of pure frustration, I developed this way of making images from the smog in the air. And the basic method is to cut a stencil, and I place it on plexiglass or other objects for varying lengths of time and set these out on my rooftop. And after the stencil is removed, the image is made from the smog in the air. Here's a detail so you can see what it looks like. I also brought one Smog Collector so that you could actually see it and touch it. It's made up of particulate matter. That's really what causes the visibility problem with smog. And particulate matter is made up of different things depending on the location. It's primarily oil products from emissions from cars and autos and factories. Some of it even comes, for instance, when rubber hits the road with a moving tire, small bits of rubber fly into the air. In different areas where, say, recycling takes place, it may be made up of small particles of fibers. I've done these smog collectors in many different cities, and even in places like Santa Barbara where, when I first did it, I said, I don't know what it's going to happen. You may not get anything. So, it was terrible because what I found was that a lot of these tourist sites, even though they're by the ocean and, Santa Monica and your location, also, even though there's sort of this illusion that it's clean, there's so many automobiles in these kind of areas that the smog level is actually quite high. This is a self-portrait actually of me catching smog, so that if I catch enough of it, you won't have to breathe it. Most of the images I create with the Smog works take these sheets of plexiglass, and in this case it's a dinner for two made out of the Smog, and then I build larger structures like this table with its car muffler legs. I really respond well to this idea of the domestic, in part because so much of the problems that we have really is about the fact that years ago we wanted these really clean houses and kitchens, you know, and also because there's always this feeling that you're like safe in your home, that somehow the danger of the environment is outside and, you know, you're quite safe. There's also another weird illusion with the Smog in that it always looks like it's in somebody else's backyard, somebody else's neighborhood, because it always seems obvious from a distance, and you're probably standing in the only safe place in the city. Many of the pieces also have to deal with my daughter. She's 8 years old now, but this was her high chair with her peanut butter and sandwich and, you know, lunch made out of Smog, and her baby bassinet. This particular piece was sort of a surprise to me. I had been asked to do a show in Belgium, and I knew that that table was really going to be too heavy to ship, and so I suggested that I would try to make a tablecloth by the same method, and then just with the use of a tablecloth we could begin the installation. And by chance I picked silk as the material, and I cut out the stencil as I do with the typical Smog Collectors, and what happened was there's so much acid in the air that it actually darkened the silk. Some of the smaller pieces that are in an installation like I just showed you are typically books and clocks and things that people would normally have in their homes. These books on the right are called the Wonder Books. They're subtitled things like Great Inventors and Their Inventions and Modern Achievements in Industry, and then I've cut them open and embedded them with Smog Collectors that tell a whole different story. On the left is a globe of the world with a Liberty dollar on the top, in fact. I thought I'd show you a couple examples of how I sort of think through these Smog Collectors. I've tried different types of images. I think depending on what I'm saying through the image, it really tells a different idea. On the right is Bruegel's, you know, like a Smog translation of Bruegel's The Blind Leading the Blind. So that tells a particular type of story when it's translated into Smog. And on the left is something more practical. It's the daily forecast, you know, in the newspaper where you can see what the smog levels will be. On the right are translations of the Skyline of Los Angeles. In fact, it's that same 60-block radius that I did translated into Smog. And I thought I'd show you the one on the left. Also, by some strange coincidence, during the LA riots years ago, I had put on the rooftop just the day before the presidential seal, a bunch of portraits of George Bush, and all. And I was really close to where the riots took place, so the air was full of ash for about 3 days. So I kept them out only for 3 days, so that presidential seal is really made from the ash in the air. These are the latest ones that I had done. I really don't make the Smog Collectors in the last few years, but when I did that show at Oberlin College, I sort of seized an opportunity. I had really wanted to do Ansel Adams photos in Smog, and I made the big mistake of writing to the Ansel Adams Foundation and asking for their permission, and they said no, and they said they had asked his widow, and she hated the idea, and, you know, so next time just do it, you know, find out later. And so in Oberlin, I told them my dilemma, so they let me into their their personal collection of photographs, and I translated things like Margaret Burke White photos into Smog, and I made the choice to make them identical to the size of the original photographs so that these forever will be displayed side by side. I did a project for the Bureau of Automotive Repair. I hope you've all done your smog checks, because they're the ones that are watching over you. And in fact, the smog checks do help a lot in terms of the way Los Angeles air pollution has been. I made these sculptures out of car and truck mufflers and catalytic converters, and I put these really pretty marbleized finishes on them and placed a stencil on them so that the pedestrians could see the smog being collected over periods of time. I created 7 of these sculptures that were placed in different locations around the city, and after the project was completed, they toured to about 60 businesses and corporations, primarily to encourage rideshare and mass transportation. With each one, I had a bilingual text and image that told things like the 800 numbers for doing the mass transit and ride share, and also smog tips for your car, and how this process worked, because I really don't like the idea that I do this work and then lose people along the way. And also I think there's a certain importance in this kind of work that you really offer the audience more information, that you don't just like tell them a problem that they already know, that somehow they can go home with some more information and then make their own choices. I did a lot of public speaking for the Bureau, which I think is kind of a kick, and I actually did a lot of research so that when I did the speaking, I could, speak proficiently in the kinds of facts and figures that were required to talk about the smog. But, I also have my own political views on it, and nobody really stopped me from, my point of view on things. And at one point, there was a congressperson that was really upset that the state of California had spent this money on this project, and they didn't really spend that much. It was something like, it was under $4,000. It really, for all the work and stuff, it really wasn't that much cash. And I was called up to Sacramento for a hearing, as were the PR people that were involved in it, and because of that, they had to find out how effective this campaign had been. And it turned out that as a PR campaign, meaning media coverage and so on, it was the most successful in the history of the state of California. So by the time we got up to Sacramento, the congressperson canceled the hearing, of course, because he had found out the same information, and we were sent home with our little smog collectors. So I find that some of these projects where art is really used as a way to give information presents this stuff in a whole different light. If you gave people just facts and figures about this stuff, which they do, read in the newspaper, it really doesn't impact somebody as much as really seeing smog for themselves. A lot of what I've done in the last few years is to teach teachers about how to make these smog collectors, and they're used in classrooms to teach kids about the smog, and to kind of, again, use art as a way to access this information by making a project out of it. I'm just finishing up right now an activity book, an environmental activity book that is funded by the Los Angeles Cultural Affairs Department, and by popular demand, so to speak, the Smog Collector instructions are in it. It's a bilingual book. I just find that really important in our city to really reach a broader audience. It really uses that kind of highlight magazine sort of imagery and style. And on the right, for instance, is stationery, so a kid can write to whoever they really think is in charge here on everything. And it's a recycled constellation sky. And the page on the left is really taking that sky patch piece that I showed you where I documented the sky for 60 days toward Riverside and uses it as a way for kids to really observe their sky. On the right is a maze that's made up of the storm drain system, and you're supposed to figure out who dumped the trash. And on the left is a typical strategy where you have kids count the kind of trash that comes out of their house so they really have more of a sense of, you know, how much trash is really generated each week. I've also put together exhibitions and have served actually on a lot of think tank panels that involve both scientists and I've served on think tanks for arboretums, and I find that we're really entering the time period where there's much more interdisciplinary activity. And even though when I start on these groups and we're all sitting there looking at each other, everybody's sort of suspicious of the role everybody else plays. By the time these conferences are finished, there's really a great deal of knowledge gained by sharing information from different disciplines and different points of view. This particular exhibition brought in scientists from the Air Pollution Research Laboratory out at Riverside, and it was held at the Museum of Photography, which is part of UC Riverside. And it brought together, as I say, both the artists with the scientists. On the right, in fact, is two greenhouses that the scientists constructed, one which pumps existing air from outside the museum and one which pumps in filtered air, so you can really see the difference between these plants. And on the left we had bulletin boards and other ways that people could access information. On weekends we had things like alternative cars, you know, electric cars, and different activities to bring people in. This is work by two different artists. This is Michael Miller's piece on the left. This piece, if you lift off the cork tops, he has drenched the gauze that's inside in motor oil, so they really give off a terrible stench. And you'll see if you look at the plaques that are behind it that what he's done is he pulled together images of all the automobiles and motorcycles that are named after Native American tribes and, you know, ironically now used on automobiles. And there's that, you know, that quirky relationship then that, you know, the land of a peoples who really respected nature wound up being names for, you know, like Cherokee Jeeps and stuff. On the right is a piece by Sant Khalsa, who used a more romantic or poetic point of view. The bottom of the installation is covered with soil, and it's really a meditative type room where the lung shapes are really made out of tree branches in photographic form. For my part in the exhibition, I made commemorative presidential smog plates. I did all the presidents from McKinley to George Bush made out of smog, and I put these two together so you can see the difference between them. If their environmental records were worse, I left them out longer. So that's why Reagan's so dark, and I thought FDR and Teddy really tried. I also thought Jimmy Carter tried a little bit. So they're the lightest. They were out for only 4 days. And Reagan and George Bush and Taft were out for 40 days. And then everybody else is sort of grades of gray in between. I researched all the quotes they had said about the environment or industry. And of course, what was so striking was that, remember George Bush used to call himself the environmental president, and you know, every day I'd go outside and start coughing, and it's so striking that politicians and leaders can sort of say anything and it's written down in the books, and then there's a secondary reality of the world that all of us live in. And so
sometimes their quotes were really funny. Like in the case of Ronald Reagan, there were quite a few quotes. So I actually made a lot of Reagan plates, because he's the president that said, "You've seen one redwood, you've seen them all." And in this particular case, he's blaming 80% of the pollution on hydrocarbons released from plant life. So, and actually, at the Democratic Convention, which was held shortly after he made that quote, they were making fun of him for saying that, and his rebuttal a couple days later in the paper was, "I didn't say 80%, I said 75%. Hoover was the president who promised a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage. And as I said, George Bush is the president that wants to be remembered as the environmental president that's helped us more than anybody else. The other thing that I sort of liked about these in the presentation was that I used, of course, historical images of, most of the presidents, but all the presidents that had been presidents in my lifetime, I sort of pictured them more in terms of what they look like in newspaper articles and things. So they tend to be more contemporary or more, less formal in their presentations. Woodrow Wilson, I thought, was pretty interesting because he really forewarned in 1913 of this direction we were taking in industry and the sort of fate that it would put on men and women and children of the future and in their own living. And Eisenhower, I thought, was also kind of interesting. I mean, I was born in 1952, so I'm really like a 50s kid, and in the 50s everything was really clean, and it was this attitude, like I said, about the kitchens, that everything was going to be Band-Aid clean and safe. And Eisenhower describes the smoke coming from smokestacks as these like beautiful billows and like choruses singing. So it's like such a different attitude from what we know now. I did a project in the last year and a half, 2 years, with the Santa Monica Bay Restoration Project to try to teach people about the storm drain system in LA. There's about 5,000 miles of storm drain system in Los Angeles, and I always love this image that even as I'm standing here, there's probably a whoosh of water that's going underneath us on its way to the beach. And people don't even think about these types of infrastructure because you don't see them most of the time. And they're so critical to the development of an urban area. Of course, they're put there because we've put so much concrete on the cities that when it rains, any kind of natural absorption cannot happen. So you got to take that water somewhere. And so when you see beach trash like that at the beach, it's really not from beachgoers, it's really from people in other parts of the city that have left garbage on the street. On the right is a picture of my old neighbor's backyard, and of course when it rains, all that stuff's going to make its way down the street and into the catch basins, which you see. There's been a wonderful stencil campaign by Heal the Bay that I'm sure all of you have seen at some time or another, trying to at least educate people about those catch basins and their purpose, and that they do go to the ocean. The weird thing about a catch basin, because I do lecture about this a lot, especially with young kids and stuff, is that unless somebody told you that, it kind of looks like a trash receptacle. So it really does require telling somebody the purpose of it, that it's really just for water. The storm drain system really makes use of some of the natural watershed that happens in LA, and it does go over and under the land and then does wind up at the beach. And my daughter and I spent about 4 days after a rainstorm collecting the storm drain trash, and some of you should go there after a rain. You wouldn't believe how much trash is down there. And we did this sort of painstaking process of sorting all this stuff. And then I washed it all. And then we further sorted it And the dolphin that you've already seen is really the result of this project. It closes like a regular suitcase and snaps shut, and I carry it into classrooms, and almost like a magician, I use it, especially for younger kids, it's sort of great with, use it to point out what these items are, where they should have gone, and really go through the whole dialogue about the storm drain system with them. This exhibition, Encyclopedia Persona, it is a 15-year survey of my work that started in Santa Monica Museum and then was picked up by the United States Information Agency and toured through South America for the last year and a half. It actually just went to its last venue in Caracas a couple weeks ago and has now returned. And just from what you've seen about the samples of the work that I've shown you, it makes sense that we would use this 1960s World Book as a format to discuss my work, because the background information is just as critical to me as these objects that I make. This was a collaboration between myself and designer Susan Silton and curator Karen Moss. And the book is identical to that 60s World Book in the font and the format. I did a lot of research getting archival photographs, signatures of people, background information in terms of maps that were made especially for the book, as well as images of the art. There's a lot of cross-referencing, there's suggested reading, and charts like the one you see on the left about Calamity Jane to tell further facts about her life and about the piece. The page on the left is the media page. Rather than making some kind of chart, it struck me to make Frankenstein's heart out of all these odd materials that I use in the work. This is a project that I finished about 6 months ago in collaboration with Art Commotion, which is an art magazine that's on the net now. This is an interactive work, and I've taken some of these shots off the computer, so I'll try to explain this to you. What I did was to make the La Brea tar pits as the center of the city and made concentric circles with that as the center. And every time I photographed on one side of the city, I would have to find the point that was exactly equidistant on the other side of the city, and I went and photographed that area. On the computer, once you pick one of those sites, what comes up is a more detailed image of the map, so you can see exactly where these locations were. And there you see the La Brea tar pits. And what was kind of great about that site, you could actually access the website for the Page Museum, which is part of the La Brea tar pits. And I love that idea about the internet, that idea of being able to go deeper and deeper into the ideas. And once you press the different sites, the paired sister sites, as I called them, came up. Now, some of them had sound to them. So, for instance, my daughter and I snuck into a wedding that was downtown, and that's the bride and her mother. And I also have my audio recorder, so I taped the wedding march once it began, so you can get the sound of some of these sites as they happen. Two of the sites were done on video, so you can actually access that site during a 24-hour period and see every minute of that 24 hours what that site looks like. And the site that I selected was 2nd and Broadway downtown, and then I rented a room at the Holiday Inn over by Bel Air and on the 13th floor so we could look down and see the freeway below. I like the idea that these were sites that sort of were always matched together, but nobody ever really knew it. And especially in a city like Los Angeles, there's such a variety. Like on the right is actually a movie set. So that's an explosion, and that's another one of the audio sites. Pacific Design Center. I'm interested to do this project in other locations. A friend of mine actually suggested even overlaying the mapping that I've already done onto another city to see what the further sister sites are. This is Watts Towers on the right and up in Van Nuys on the left. So you see sometimes I went into people's homes. I really tried to maximize the best out of any given area. I wasn't always looking in the same direction. I just looked for the best shot in that spot where I was standing. I thought I'd show you some of these matched up. The people where I took at that donut shop, they thought I was going to close them down. I mean, sometimes these experiences are just awful. You know, especially when you have a camera, you look so powerful. The other funny thing that I found out when I started the project was that I thought I was going all over the city, and once I would really go home and I'd sort of observe for the day where I had been, because I wound up going to about 120 sites, and I kept going east-west, east-west, east-west. It was like I couldn't get myself to go north-south because I never do that. And so it really set in my head like what my own personal patterns were in terms of my experience in the city also. I love this bush on the right because it looked like a really bad haircut or something. The other thing that I didn't really plan in terms of the piece, and it turned out to be, I thought, one of the more powerful aspects was just the way nature kind of came up. On the left is actually this abandoned gas station where the tanks have been dug up and has turned into this like gorgeous, surreal, rolling hill within this small area. And on the right, of course, is the more typically groomed yard that people see. That's our more typical use in view of nature. And then this type of nature where, you know, it's at the zoo and it's contrived for us. And then check this out. It's like, look at that place on the right. It looks like it's Hawaii. And that's somebody's front yard. And of course, a lot of these, you see the little guard, you know, security tags. You know, everything's sort of guarded here. And that house on the left, it's near USC. It's being moved. That's why it's up like that. And then, like, who thought to do that? They should be arrested. It's like... I mean the one on the right, yeah. Okay. Anyway, that's just an overview of some of the work, and as you know, I've got some books up here if you do want to see some of them. I do a lot of artist books because I find that all this background information needs to fit somewhere, and limited edition books are a great place to do it. And I'll be happy to answer any questions, or I will be here if you want to, yes. You know, now that's on CD-ROM, but at that particular site, which is under Art Commotion, artcommotion.com, check it out anyway, even though my piece isn't on there, because now Yoko Ono did the next interactive one, and I haven't seen it yet, but I'm sure it must be interesting, so you might want to look at that. Well, I actually found a product that Scotch makes, because at first when I started doing those, I tried just using regular contact paper, and it would sort of fuse, but actually contact paper has improved just in the last year and a half because I've been working with kids a lot, and now it's easier to pull off, so you could just go ahead and do that. And as long as you don't leave it in the sun, because the sun, of course, you know, makes it far too hot and the glue starts to melt. Mm-hmm. 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 Well, I think an individual always thinks that they are at the center. I mean, I think it's that way, but I don't think that politically that's considered the center. And so I sort of wanted to force the issue by making it the center. And when I say politically, I mean, you know, just the structure of cities is not planned with that as the center, you know, the way people commute, the politics of you know, employment, any of that does not really say that it is. So I guess I wanted to make it that instead. Yeah. For the same thing about that equidistant piece, it's like sort of forcing the issue of something being a center, which was really not ever intended to be the center. I mean, in the case of that one, La Brea Tar Pits was a perfect site because that's sort of the center of time also. So it should be the center of the city. Okay, well, thank you very much.